Well, John Eric, he is not present at the moment. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So let's move through, table his. So
are we waiting for the mayor? Or should we go?
I mean, I don't think it would hurt to start running through some of the previous meeting action points before the mayor gets here, because we're not hitting any of the things that I think would be more significant for her participation.
Unless, Andy, I'm at you at 1.3, it says the point was follow up with the mayor for guidance on setting the Plum Island group following the MVP report. Are you able to speak to that?
Yeah, we're actually waiting for the final report from the consultants. So I think we'd like to see a little bit of how that's structured and what's in there.
Okay.
Should be getting that final report relatively soon, because the final comments were due last week. So
yeah, we think within a week or two we're going to have that.
So by the end of the month.
Yeah, I would definitely think by then. Yeah, and we can obviously share that report and kind of talk together, I guess, about the contents and findings.
All right, great.
Julia, Andy, was a draft sent out of that at any point? There were a few of us that were supposed to review the draft, and we just never. I never received it.
We had seen, I don't know if it was the entire report, but we certainly had seen some portions of, Julie and I at least had seen some. I don't remember who wanted it copied, but we can circle back if you haven't seen.
I haven't seen anything, to be totally honest. And I was checking my emails, and one of the emails I got was referring to Rishi, to you being one of the people who are going to be reviewing it and providing comments. And then there was some sort of a deadline of last week, the 16th, for those comments. But are you saying you never even got the draft?
I never got the draft, and I reached out to Ellie a couple of days ago when I saw the email being like, you know, I just wanted to make sure I was doing what I said I'd do. I just haven't seen it.
So
yeah, I haven't seen it either.
Let's reach out on that email chain to Ellie Baker and check in. I see the mayor's joined us. Mayor,
trying.
I know. Who's going to reach out?
I will. I will send an email to Ellie and ask her for a status report on the situation.
Great. Okay. Anything else on that? No. Moving on, and Rishi, I think someone, maybe myself, I don't know, or David was going to follow up to talk to you about presenting either today or next week on the RMAT standards. And I'm sorry if no one reached out to you.
That's okay. I have like 10 quick slides I can go through if you want. It's really up to you.
What do you think, how long do you think that would get?
It's however long, it probably take 5 minutes. I don't think it's really that much. I mean, to be honest, like it's such at a nascent stage. And since the primary rollout's happening in 2022, all you can really do is give a very high level overview of what it is and what it's trying to do.
Well, I think if you can do it in 5 minutes. We've been putting it off for a bit. I think it would be great to hear from you.
I agree with that.
Yep. This is definitely not a great presentation. I'm just warning you all.
No,
this is much more of just giving a high level saying this is kind of the state of what they've done. Okay, everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So at a very high level, what RMAT is doing is it's being run by two different parts of the administration. The first one is MEMA, which is obviously the Massachusetts Emergency Management Association, and then the Energy and Environmental Affairs. And that's really what's making up the sort of basic underlying premise of what they're trying to do and trying to find ways to actually allocate grant money. It's taking two different plans and combining them. So I'm sure you've seen this graphic, but this was also in the Harvard Kennedy School graphic in terms of the hazard mitigation plan and the climate adaptation plan, and it's bringing that together. And the key thing it's doing is, and I think this is where it's most powerful, it's really a clearinghouse in a lot of ways, where they're taking 6 different agencies across Massachusetts and dumping them all into one big central depository. So DCAM, which is the Department of Capital Asset Management and Maintenance, so they pretty much see almost all public work for, let's say, buildings and campuses and so on across Massachusetts. Mass Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Department of Public Health, the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, and then also the EEA, Department of Environmental Protection. And the key thing here is that the good thing, I think, starting in 2022 for all of us is that where each of these agencies prior to this would have probably put out their own grant funding requests in the past, is that they're now going to compile it all through this process. And it'll just be one big depository for us to go ahead and get money. And then each one of these agencies will now dole out money based upon how they actually see, based upon the particular request. So for instance, if it's, let's say, a building improvement, it may come down to, depending if it's housing or if it's a state building, it may come down to DCAM or the Department of Housing to go ahead and then allocate those funds. Any questions about that? So it should make things easier for us in the long run. So this one, I'm a little bit skeptical. So this is what it's saying it's doing. And so the primary thing that it's trying to do is, first, it wants to really give us a preliminary climate change exposure and risk rating. And it does do that. So any of us who've looked at the Harvard Kennedy School's analysis, which I'll kind of get into a little bit of detail towards the end of it, because to be honest, it's the best thing that's out there right now from everything I've been able to find. It's giving essentially an analysis based upon the inputs that we put into the system on what is the climate risk exposure and what is the risk rating for each different category. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. The second part of it, I don't really necessarily agree that it's actually doing, which is that it's actually giving us resilience design standards for physical assets and best practices to support implementation. I think in the long run, that's what they want to do. There's a process that's behind this in the government where they have essentially 5 different stages that we'll look at in a second in terms of the workflow. And I think in the long run, they want to develop this, but this doesn't really exist right now. So how do we actually engage and do this is a little bit of a question. And it's also something that I think everyone who did the work from Harvard Kennedy, I didn't go to that presentation, unfortunately, couldn't make it. But from what I read through from like the reports, it's in line with what they had suggested.
Richie, could you take a question, or do you want to wait for the end to the end?
Can absolutely take questions, Barry.
Is this design standards for retrofits or for prospective projects?
I think it's both. So I think it's like, so at the building scale, I think it is for retrofits. And this is a little bit of the confusion that I have about how the grant funding is actually going to be distributed in the long term when they consolidated this whole entire thing. But I'm assuming they have distributed buckets behind the scene that say, yes, if you're looking for a building retrofit, that enables you to then go ahead and get money from whatever fund they've actually set up as part of this process.
Yeah, thank you.
Prospective projects it's the whole gambit. It runs from the building scale to large scale infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's completely across the board.
Thank you.
There's 3 primary categories. There's infrastructure, natural resources, and then building. Overall, it's the 3 categories that they've identified. And there's 4 different inputs that we have to put in for each of those 3 categories. So as we're actually applying for any of those different categories, we have to put in the project details, the ecosystem benefits, the location and exposure, and then the asset information. And I'm going to come back to this at the end because they're asking for a lot of information. And I think some of that evaluation stuff that we were hoping that this tool would do up front, it doesn't necessarily do that. I think what it really I'll get to it. I think we need to do more studies. So this is just from they have actually some pretty good graphics that just really talk about how the planning, procurement, project design, and project review standard is actually done. And that starts to speak to, again, since there's really hasn't been a project that's been run through the standard, there is no concrete example of exactly how this gets implemented right now from what I've been able to find. I did reach out. I have some contacts with Weston and Sampson. I haven't heard back from them yet. So I'm trying to reach out to them to see if I can actually get a little more information. They pulled this all together for the state. But at a 10,000 foot level, it seems like a normal sort of project planning process where we go ahead and we identify the scope. Then there's a part where we go ahead and they'll give a certain allocation of the money. But I think, and this is also within the Harvard Kennedy School report, it's acknowledging the fact that no matter how much money is actually within this process that RMN actually has set forward, that there's probably not enough money to actually fund all of our projects within this sort of grant funding cycle. So we have to look for other ways on top of this to go ahead and implement the work. So then they have a number of different, so these are the 5 primary people that are actually part of it. So you have a project manager who's really looking at just the inputs and outputs and helping make sure that all the information that was supposed to go into the system has gone into the system. There's a technical staff that applies the standards and guidelines. Again, back to the physical assets. I haven't been able to find those guidelines, and I have to reach out to the state to try to figure out what those are. But as far as I can tell, those standards don't exist yet, and I'm assuming those come online in 2022. There's an asset owner's role who coordinates with the state PM and the technical staff. And the key thing here is that person is really just the behind the scenes person who's making sure that the grant funding request is moving forward. There's a program manager who is supposed to help all of us in terms of how we actually navigate the tool, and then and make sure that the procurement goes well. And then there's a reviewer who I actually think is the most important person in this whole entire thing, which is really talking about reviewing the project with the different state agencies. So as we actually put these projects forward within whatever design standards that we put forward and all that information, is to make sure that that information is just consistent with what they're actually looking for from an agency perspective. So those are 5 key people. And what they're supposed to be getting out of this is a climate risk screening output, which we'll look at in a second from what Harvard Kennedy School did. And then there's also the climate resilience design standards output, which from everything I can tell and from also the report that we got, doesn't really seem like it's there just yet. And so the basic overview, so this is directly from the Harvard Kennedy School's report. They kind of went into exactly how this is supposed to be putting in some inputs. There's a design standards tool, and they're supposed to give you these outputs in terms of exposure ratings, risk ratings, the overall benefits to your environmental, to the localized environment, and then the project design criteria and recommendations. It definitely doesn't do number 4 in any type of capacity right now, from what I can tell. And so as part of what they did, they went ahead and they plugged in these 10 different sites. And then, is everyone familiar with this? I don't want to go ad nauseum. Has everyone seen this? Tell me if I just shouldn't do this, but this is the output essentially that you get from it, where it runs it through and it puts it through these 3 different lenses of sea level rise, the storm surge, urban flooding, and I didn't put in the riverine flooding as part of this just because it's a little redundant in terms of the overall matrices that comes out of it. But then it puts each one of these into different categories from a site prioritization perspective. Spits out like essentially they get the information, doesn't look this nice. These guys formatted everything in terms of just getting into a simple table. Gives us a table in terms of what's high risk or low risk in terms of the different sites. And then they put in this, which is, I think, dead on from what I've been able to see, which is in terms of the application of the limitations associated with the tool. And particularly, I think on the limitation side, the key thing is that it's really not doing any type of comparative analysis for us. So it's not taking different scenarios that we may develop in terms of how do we actually solve any of these problems and to do some sort of comparison within what I'm assuming is feasibility or costs or so on. It doesn't really help us with that. And it's also not really helping us in terms of like the overall large scale risk analysis. It's only as good as the inputs you put into it. In the end is really what it breaks down to. So if we don't have the background information up front, then what we actually get out of the process is not going to be that great. So again, my 10,000 foot takeaway is that we have to perform our own studies in a way, very similar to what was done for Plum Island. We're gonna have to do the studies, look at scenario development, talk to feasibility, go ahead and actually define a scope based upon that, and then look to phased cost in terms of like overall implementation. And I think the last point about phased cost is absolutely critical because, again, as this study noted, and from everything I've been able to see online, from what I've been looking at, what we probably get through RMAT is never going to cover the cost of what it takes to actually do some of the improvements, which is as you're actually looking at the Harvard Kennedy School's recommendations, that's the reason why they're saying to leverage on debt, and their whole entire arguments, essentially that interest rates are really low right now, so we should borrow more, which I think is always up for debate. But I think that's the basic premise of this. And that at a kind of 10,000 foot level, I don't know, was that helpful at all? Or there's very little information on this really out there right now. from what I've been able to find.
I think that was really helpful, Rishi. Thank you.
So
Extremely
Rishi,
Are there any
helpful.
questions?
yeah, this is Sarah, and I thought one of the points of the tool was to compare projects across, and I think you said this, across the state. So if our input is better and it's compared to somebody whose input is bad, is that in our favor or not?
I actually don't know, because if you go in with too much data, and then at some point that actually skews it, it makes it look, I don't know the analysis of that. I mean, I always trend towards having more data is better, particularly as we're trying to like mitigate some of these issues, because the cost, I mean, the big thing that I'm kind of seeing across the country in these is that we may come in with an initial cost and then that cost balloons significantly in the long run, and we just can't implement these projects. Because the infrastructure side of these things is just so out of control. So I would always trend towards more data, just so we understand what we're getting ourselves into, and then kind of curate the information how we need it to be to then go ahead and pursue the money. Does that answer the question, Sarah?
Yep,
Wanna make sure.
absolutely. Thank you.
I have a quick question too, Jane.
Go ahead.
Rishi, I don't know if you know this, but do you know if it looks at energy type or usage, like fossil fuel versus renewable, and if it looks at life cycle costs of the building in terms of the life cycle of the building as well as the energy usage?
It's not doing
any of
any.
that?
Yeah, it's not doing, as far as I can tell, it's not really doing that. This is purely a mitigation.
Okay, purely
Well-
that's all they're looking at. They're not looking at, if you have to run natural gas lines or whatever for new buildings. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's much more on the building side of things, as we're actually talking about like some of the more recent code updates, even though we couldn't get the most recent energy code mandated by the state. Some of the language is changed by the governor. Not complaining about the governor, like the governor. But I think the part of this, I think, is that there isn't anything in terms of like the way that we have to, there's different standards of stretch codes that come out, things like
Right,
that have
right.
helped us with buildings, but that's still very much on the building code side of things,
Okay.
if I can tell.
It would be great if it had more on the type of energy, but that's okay. Okay.
Just wanted to add that I believe that this is a gigantic step forward for the state in terms of actually beginning to really incorporate these kinds of parameters into grant programs, into projects, infrastructure, buildings. And I don't think it's going to happen right away. I think even if they do say, a certain grant program, they had been talking about consolidating, for example, under one stop, some of the Mass Works grants and some of the other grant programs, which they just did for the first time, and they had been talking about it for 5 years. And that's simple. They weren't changing any of the programs. They were just consolidating them into one grant application. I think that we're very fortunate to have Secretary Thea Harris, who's overseeing this, and Beth Card is now her undersecretary. And she came to our ribbon cutting for the rail trail, and she lives on Ship Street here in Newburyport, and she's the undersecretary. So I think that's wonderful. We've had a couple really good conversations. I think this is really important information, but I don't want us to get too excited about the state moving too quickly. I mean, you look at the 3-year process we did just trying to get a vote at the council for the purchase of the Low Street property from DCAM. 3 years. You think they're going to be able to pull something like this off? I really think this is important. It's great work. I'm glad that they're moving in this direction. But I think, Rishi, you're right. We're going to have to do our own analysis, and the more that we can rise to the top in terms of, the work that we're doing. I've shared our resiliency plan with Beverly and Salem, and I was really surprised that neither one of those communities had even started resiliency plan, like 6 months ago. I don't know where they are at this juncture, but, I think with this ARPA money coming, and other stimulus money into the state, that we might see some more effort and some more programming, some more training, some more development, but we also need to understand that they don't have the staff at the state level either at this point. So, but I appreciate you taking the time to dig through this, and I think we're gonna have to keep on this, and as it keeps being updated and incorporated into plans that we want to put forward. So thank you, Rishi, appreciate the update.
Yeah, no problem. Mayor Holiday, I think I was actually talking to Beth quite a bit about this because her son is actually best friends with my son. So we see them almost on a weekly basis. And the biggest thing that just talking to her about this, I think, is to your point about the overall implementation is going to take time. And I think her point on this was the good thing about living in Massachusetts is that we do have this program. The bad thing is that no other state has executed anything like this anywhere in the country. This is the first of its type program really like this anywhere in the country. And so when we actually think about it in terms of its long-term implementation, is that it's going to have its growing pains. And I think the impetus for this and what gives me a little bit of hope is that Beth, she's been doing this for so many years, at first at the NWRA, and she's kind of moved from MIPA, and she's been doing all this stuff for years and years. She understands, and I think the people she's working with really understand the need for it, and they're trying their best to push this thing through, but it's a big task. So.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Rishi. I'm sure this is only the beginning of hearing more about this.
Yeah, that's great. Good job.
Should we move on to the mayor's blog?
Are
Andy?
are we raising our hands electronically, or we're just jumping in?
What do we normally do? If we raise the hands, I'll be looking for them, Barry.
Okay, my hand's up.
All right, go ahead, please.
I'll be real brief. Richie, two questions. The first one's a comment, not a question, and that is, I don't believe, and Donna, you can correct me, that the mayor is arguing that we shouldn't continue to develop the local analysis, the data that will justify a future application. As a matter of fact, to the extent that we continue to move forward in that direction, we'll be preparing ourselves to be first in line or early in the line. And I see Donna's giving me a thumbs up on that. But my question is, at this point, how many dollars are we talking about? How much money is in the pot potentially?
That I don't know. That I have no clue. I don't think there's been a complete compilation of the grant funds, but I'm speaking out of school on that. I actually don't know. I don't have any idea.
It's a fair answer. That's fine. Okay, that's all I had.
Okay. Next up is Andy, the mayor's blog.
Yeah, Mayor, there was an inquiry to you and to Matt whether or not Sarah had put together just a short write-up or forwarded it to us for the Harvard Kennedy School project, and was wondering if that could be or has been posted, just to relay to folks information about the project and note again our partnership on that. I think, Sarah, did you want to speak to that at all? Or
No, I think that covers it.
it may have gotten sort of a little bit lost in the shuffle because there's so much going on right now.
Okay, but you'll follow up on that.
Yeah, and Mayor, I'm not sure if you're there at the moment.
Oh, I am. I'm sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry. I don't know at this juncture. I write the stuff, present the stuff, and then I just let it sort of go out there in blog, social media world. I don't really go back and look at all that stuff, but I certainly will follow up to see if it has been posted, because I think it should. But who wrote it up? Sarah, you did?
I did, Mayor, yeah. If you don't have it, I can send it to you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sarah wrote it up. I think it's a Word document or a PDF that I had forwarded to you.
Okay.
All right, great. Sounds like that is in progress. And then Andy, again, decide on how the city wants to approach CRS, and for us who are new, if you could just define CRS.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think more time is needed to talk about the details of that, before we can circle back and discuss here. But that's just that's what I would offer at this point.
Yeah, just to say what it is, though, the CRS, for those who don't know, is the community rating system that FEMA uses to allow communities to have lower FEMA flood insurance rates. And it means that the community, if you are rated as a CRS community, you've done a number of important things in their mind to reduce your overall flood risks as a community as a whole. And the benefit of that is then everyone gets a lower flood insurance rate. But it is a detailed process. It's a lot of paperwork, as everything with FEMA usually is, to achieve that rating. And other communities have done it. I believe Salisbury did it. I think they hired a consultant to do that paperwork with them and collect all the data necessary. But yeah, so that's essentially what it is.
And there are certain things that we can demonstrate clearly we've done, certain other things we can demonstrate we're making efforts to do. But like Julia said, there's a process involved with that. We want to have as much information on our site as possible to get the best possible rating. So we'll have to do a little bit more work on that between now and the next meeting to discuss where we stand.
Okay.
That's something that would be covered under MVP funding?
You mean as a grant?
Yeah.
I don't think so, only because I think they're looking for specifically design and construction projects, right? Not so much
Just thought I'd throw it out there.
yeah.
Good question.
I think this is more of an analysis of things that have been done, right? That we can take credit for, as opposed to what things we could do going forward. But
So Andy, my recollection from the last discussion on this was that there had been a discussion about not wanting to actually get the rating because reducing the cost of flood insurance goes counter to some of the goals. So
yeah, that point did come up in discussion, and I would guess open up that to the floor for discussion. It is a valid point to be made that by reducing rates, people might dismiss the vulnerabilities and so forth. But I think understandably, people might be looking to the city to see what we can do to at least reduce rates where feasible. So open to discussion, I guess.
who makes the call on that? Whether we go for the actual whatever it is, declaration or approval?
Yeah, well, obviously, our office working with the mayor would be the ones to submit the materials to ask for that review. So
This was the first Harvard Kennedy School project that they worked on with us through Congressman Moulton's office. And they came in similar to this group of students, except they were actually here on the ground. They met with us. We didn't have to do everything remote. I mean, I did have one meeting with them where they did come out and tour the city. But, and it just, if I recall correctly, Julia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was very costly to do this. And we weren't quite sure what would be the benefit at this point. And we just have so many other things going on, and we were just starting the MVP process at the time. So I think we let it sit. So I don't know, we might want to just try and get through some of the projects we're trying to get done on Plum Island before we go back and look at this again, because we've still got, this, our hazardous mitigation planning, that has to get done. That will drive the whole BRIC program, the potential buyback of any of the homes out there. So I almost think that that's the direction we should focus on first. And then once we, get some of those things done, and maybe we get the Army Corps working on fixing the spur on the jetty, then we can breathe a little bit, for about what's going on Plum Island, and could step back and maybe revisit this program. That would be my recommendation.
So
Does anybody share the concern that Sarah raised about maybe sending the wrong signal to folks about reducing rates? I mean, is that at all concern of the group at this point?
I certainly share it, but I am also coming in with very little information. So
I mean, I would just say that
I share it.
Yeah, I would say, I think that, we're talking about providing incentives for people not to move into high hazard flood areas, whereas lowering flood insurance rates in our community would be an incentive for people to move into our particular high hazard flood areas rather than another community's high hazard flood areas. But again, would it be a benefit to those residents already living in those areas in terms of reducing their flood rates? So you got to look at it from two different perspectives, but it is a bureaucratic and cost, would take city resources to achieve that, yet it wouldn't actually achieve flood resiliency for us.
So it sounds like we're not even close to making a decision if we want to do this or not. And it sounds like we should table it until maybe the fall, and then come back to it with, if someone could formulate maybe something as basic as maybe pros and cons, just for us to get our heads around it. Does that sound?
Paul's too soon. We're
Paul's
the dredging project, potentially short-term protection out there. There's too much going on right now in terms of Plum Island, and we just don't have the resources or the funding right now. And I would rather us get the hazardous mitigation plan done, move towards the brick program, get the dredging, the sand on Reservation Terrace, or the short-term project first, make sure the dredging is happening, and then we can come back. Probably the spring would make much more time because everything sort of hopefully will calm.
Yeah.
And sort of look back again at whether or not it makes sense to go forward, and maybe even bring someone from Salisbury over in terms of, so you've had this program now for what, 5-7 years. What's been the benefit? Because they have a lot of the same issues out there, in terms of residents on the beach, and have lost a lot of sand and had to fight in terms of, getting more sand and all the erosion issues. So maybe they could talk to us about some of the cost benefits of doing that.
Yeah, I would concur with the mayor on that. I would also say, just, as a matter of policy, if the committee's purpose is to support resiliency, right? And we've talked before, and we're talking today a little bit about what our priorities should be going forward now that there's a plan in place. To me, implementation and looking at the CRS program, that CRS program is really meant to encourage local communities to do actions, right? And to document those actions and thereby get maybe the reductions. So to Julia's point, and the points that have been made by others, going through this program and doing all this process to get that rating reduction doesn't really ensure any more resilience, right? All it does is reduce rates for folks that might be in that area now or in the future. And I'm not sure that that contributes to resilience. So if we're going to focus our efforts within the bandwidth and resources we have, like the mayor's been pointing at, I do think that's not the best point of our focus. There's other areas where we can make more progress. If it was a grant program, to the extent it might help us, get grant funds, sure, but it isn't providing any funds. It's just reducing rates, which goes back to the points that were made a moment ago.
If I could chime in on this too, Andy. To the extent that it eases some of the economic pressure people are feeling living in a flood-prone area, in a hazard-prone area, it may actually make the concept or the execution of managed retreat more attainable in their minds. So I don't think we should dismiss it entirely. I think Julia got it right. It's a balancing act. And by helping them reduce their rates, if they develop, a pool of money that could facilitate a retreat from the water's edge, then it would be helpful. If, on the other hand, it's just going to prolong that inevitable procrastination that we all do, and when we approach big decisions, then it won't work to anybody's benefit.
And I think there was also a comment last time that to the extent that there are documented best practices, pulling out those and incorporating those in other places was mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Be a moot point, as the mayor said, because resources are being stretched pretty thin. Maybe it shouldn't be our highest priority.
Yeah, it's just, I just had a quick.
We don't know what the impact of this has been on Salisbury or other communities that have adopted this. And I think that's part of what we have to do. And that might be a sort of a side project for this committee or a couple people to sort of take a look at that and see if it makes sense for us to go forward. But again, we have so many other, high level projects to take care of before that.
Great.
Just a really quick thought on this is that I'm not sure, like, if the CRS does get implemented, whether or not it's going to, let's say, be an incentive for more people to move out there or less people. But I think the primary concern, if that's the real concern, is that we shouldn't really start that zoning subcommittee that I think we spoke about. I can't remember, it was 1 call or 2 calls ago, because parallel to this, let's say if we actually do push down the rates for people, to your point, Barry, I think to go ahead and shove down the cost of potentially moving off the island, to say they could save that nest egg to possibly do that type of managed retreat.
Yeah.
If you roll it out parallel to, let's say, a new zoning ordinance that's not just a Newburyport zoning ordinance, but combined with Newbury, that actually gives saying, here are our planning standards, and these are the reason why for the island, and starts to put a cap on it, so we actually do controlled development at the same exact time, then that is, I think, will go directly to your argument. Right? Yeah. We're going to try to do everything that we can to make it easier for you to move off the island. But in order for that, to happen. This is a reason why, and then these are the new policies moving forward, because we have to control our exposure as a community on it.
Agree with that.
All right, great. So it sounds like we're going to revisit this in a while, but perhaps keep it in mind for going forward, just seeing how others have fared and what they're doing, and ways to make it into possibly a carrot for changing development patterns.
Right, and I think we should pull together some of the information that the Kennedy School students did pull together for us. And I can look into that, and I think David had a lot of the information as well.
Okay,
So
great.
when we do revisit that, we should pull all that material together as well.
All right, thank you, Molly. Well, on the interest in time, are these meetings normally an hour? I should have asked before, or do they go a little longer?
We typically try to keep it to the hour, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on then. Update on multi-hazard mitigation plan planning. Is everyone that's on the call familiar with this effort? I know that we talked about it I think for the last couple meetings, but I just want to make sure that everyone's familiar before we move into the details. Sounds like we are. Julia, can you pull up that? Did you receive that spreadsheet that I had sent you?
I did. Thank you for sending that. And I was going through it earlier this afternoon. I could pull it up if you'd like. Should I do that? Get it off my other computer over here. Hold on.
And while Julie is doing that, just to review, the last meeting, David had talked about, we had talked about how to incorporate all the action points from the resiliency plan into the city's updated hazardous mitigation plan. And we broke it down to, I think, 158 action points, decided that's a little overwhelming to look at, even to figure out who's responsible for what. And so what David has gone and done now is, we met with the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, who's going to help us with this plan last week, and we decided that David would sort of consolidate the points into maybe up to 30 action points. And so that has happened. That's what Julia is going to pull up, and I'm going back and looking at that, taking a look at the 150 action points from the resiliency plan and the 30 that have been boiled down, and just cross-checking because it was a really big effort that David did in a very short amount of time. And then, so from there, and Julia, if you can't, I don't think
I'm just trying to get it on a thumb drive and then get it over to the laptop because my computer at the office doesn't support Zoom. So
no
it's
worries.
a little complicated.
Well, it's also a draft, so it's not super important that we're not taking a final look at it by any means, because I still need to go through and cross-check. And then we'll start to probably carry over the suggestions for department responsibilities and timeline, and then we'll send it back to the hazard mitigation group as well as this group, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay, I've got it. I'm going to open it up and hold on a sec here. I'll share my screen in a second. So then I'll get back to Zoom and I'll do share screen. Oops. All right, here we go. Can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so as Jane was saying, she and David did a lot of work to bring all of the resiliency plan action items into the hazard mitigation plan formatting. It ended up being, I don't remember how many hundred action items there were, but we met with Jennifer Hughes of MVPC last week, and she recommended that we tailor that down quite a lot. We only really want like a few pages of this spreadsheet to be actually in the hazard mitigation plan. So a lot of them were duplicative or highly detailed. So David and Jane went back and condensed them, grouped them together, and sort of just broadened their scope a little bit. So now there are, what is it now, 20?
28 or so.
Yeah, 28. I went through these today and I think they look great. I think there were a few that I felt like were missing, particularly related to the water supply. And so I think we could add a couple in that area. And then we need, of course, to add a few sort of non-climate specific or non-sea level rise specific recommendations back in from the previous plan, which I was looking at again today as well. So I don't know what everyone thinks is the best way to go through this. Do we want to just run through them one by one and see if anybody has comment or question, or would we like to just sort of, I could email this out to everybody afterwards.
Can you send it out with a deadline and have us give comments by the end of the week or something like that?
I think that would be great. It's not quite ready to send out because I'd only made it halfway through and was continuing to find some issues with, lost in translation or missing action items. So by tomorrow, I'm hoping to have the final version, not final draft of mine. And then maybe Julia, you can send it out to the group.
That sounds great. I'd be happy to do that. And I think that makes a lot more sense than running through all of these right now. We can let people kind of digest it on their own, look back at the resiliency plan and see if they think that anything else needs to be added.
A question to Jane.
Yeah.
This is terrific. And I think in kind of graphic terms, so I find this valuable. Is it difficult to add a column that indicates how far along we are on any of these tasks? Because we have taken some steps and I think we ought to acknowledge those. And, so we can check things off as we walk through them.
That would be the project status.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Sorry.
It's too far to the left. All right, that's great.
Too big of a spreadsheet. There we go.
So that is something that it will need to be built in as well.
Okay, good. Thank
And you can see the plan also goes back and it asks whether or not it was in the previous plan and then whether or not it was been completed. So we'll have two tables in the new hazard mitigation plan. One will be accomplishments and then one will be this new table and it will reference whether or not it was in the
Sure. We have that new berm around the wastewater treatment plant, for example. And just as we check things off, we ought to at least pat ourselves in the back and say we're making some headway.
Absolutely. And then another part of this is for all of us volunteers, just trying to brainstorm how to really get us moving on this, because I think this is a great way for us to become even more engaged than we already are. So when you're taking a look at it, just in the back of your mind, or put your hand up and say, this is something that's interesting to me. My background coincides with this, and I would like to take this on. And what I think we'll do is, this is going from 158 bullet points in the resiliency plan that people worked so hard to flesh out and get out on paper, and they all need to be done. It's boiled it down to only 28, and so in that far left column is all the references the resiliency plan. And so when we are looking through and saying, trying to figure out what we want to take on, there's a lot of immediate action points. We'll go back to that first spreadsheet. And I know this is talking spreadsheet to spreadsheet, but we'll go back to that first spreadsheet, which really lays out in very, very detail, according to the resiliency plan, what needs to happen in much smaller chunks and doable chunks.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, as a newbie here that will be looking at this with looking to contribute on something finally, is there a priority here? Is it by the original numbers, or the number on the list?
Priority for each action.
Priority for each thing. I mean, which are the most important items? Are they ranked at all?
We have right now it's column F, immediate, short term, long term. And that's how those have been defined in terms of priority.
Okay, I see. All right, I didn't quite get the. All right, I get it.
Would it be useful to have somebody do like another column with just basically numbers in there, rating each one, which is the highest priority? And
well, so for this, I think that's a great idea. It would certainly be helpful, but for this hazard mitigation plan, they have a very prescribed table format that they want this in. We'll probably have to actually delete this column A on the left in order to have this be in the FEMA hazard mitigation plan.
we'll just edit it.
But
No,
for our
that's
own
big.
purposes,
Yes.
we'll retain that. And I think that's a great idea as well. And hopefully in the next meeting or so, we can go through with the immediate priorities and really start to look at them and flesh them out and prioritize them for ourselves in terms of, and I'm talking just volunteers and with city input, of course, of what we can do, how we can help out. Does that address your question, Brett?
Yeah, it does. No, that'd be great. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, concerns?
I will stop sharing this. That works. We can go back to the agenda.
Thanks, Julia. That was helpful.
Okay. I think that's all we have for the hazardous mitigation planning. Julia, did you want to add anything? Did we?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit, if I could, quickly about the time frame that we're looking at for this, because we did come up with a few dates at our meeting with Jennifer Hughes from NBPC last week. And we will be having a preparatory meeting on Thursday, August 5th, with just sort of our like small core hazard mitigation team to prepare for the first public meeting on the plan specifically, because there's a required 3 public meetings in order to get your plan accepted. You have to go through this public process. The first public meeting will be on August 18th, and that will be sort of a stakeholders advisory kind of a meeting where we'll invite specific individuals, including members of the neighboring communities to, and this group of course as well, to provide input on putting the plan together, provide input on the recommendations that we just looked at, and just to go through the process of running through those each. And then there will be 2 what they call listening sessions that we'll have probably in September. And those are just presenting to the general public what we've come up with and accepting public comment and things like that. The second of those 2 listening sessions will be a city council meeting at which the city council will be asked to adopt or approve the draft plan. And then from there, it goes to FEMA for their review and approval. And hopefully we get this done in the fall so that we'll be ready and eligible for the BRIC grant application to be submitted in December.
And I think you mentioned this, but I have to admit, I got distracted for a second. Julia, the first meeting will be our next resiliency planning.
Yes, it's actually on the same date as our next resiliency committee meeting. And we chose that specifically because we already have you guys all on board, and then we'll just invite the additional folks that we need to have there.
Okay, great. All right.
Can you say a couple words about the BRIC grant? I've heard that a couple times. I don't know what it is.
Okay. Yeah, the BRIC, it's a FEMA grant program, and it stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. It used to be their hazard mitigation something or other grants. They had combined 2 different grants and put them into this BRIC program. The reason why we are looking at submitting an application to the BRIC program this year is because we have approximately 7 homeowners on Plum Island in the Reservation Terrace neighborhood whose houses are have been damaged over and over again by the erosion that we've been seeing in that area over the past 7 years or so. They're now in sort of serious jeopardy, some of them, and they've requested that they be looked at for the FEMA buyout program. So they would like FEMA to consider buying their houses from them. If we have to go through this grant process, this grant application, a cost benefit analysis has to be done for each property that's included in the application, because FEMA will only fund it if it's a dollar benefit for the dollar cost. And then we'll find out a year later whether or not we get it. And this, if so, FEMA would purchase the property from the homeowner and then deed that property to the city after whatever structures on the lot were demolished. And then it would be deeded open space. So that's the general gist of why we're applying for this BRIC grant. But we're applying for FEMA buyouts. The BRIC grant can be used for a lot of other types of hazard mitigation projects as well.
Plus, we're required to have a hazard mitigation plan
Yes.
for the region. And we had done, we had one that we did independently. prior to my taking office 11 plus years ago. And then we worked with Merrimack Valley Planning Commission to do a regional one, and we were embedded in that. And then given the uniqueness of some of the situations we're dealing with in Newburyport, the decision is that we should pull, because ours expired the end of May. So we are without a hazardous mitigation plan at this point. Not that, you know, anybody looks at it in between that time, but it's a requirement in terms of, it's like creating a master plan. You need that to apply for other grants. You need an open space plan to apply for certain grants to the state. So this is really critical that we get this done. And at least we have really good information in terms of pulling this together. So I'm hoping that it will come together fairly quickly.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. We're getting really short on time, so I'd like to move on to organization. And Andy, it says here, are you going to just review the members of the Resiliency Committee? Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So just Julie can email this out, but just the listing of the Resiliency Committee members. There are resources in the city that aren't necessarily needed to attend every meeting, but obviously I'll be involved. Julia is a liaison from our office. So I'll be working with Molly, with Julia, with John Eric, and everyone else here on what needs to be done. But, you know, Lise Reed and so forth, you know, Parks Department Director. There are some folks that don't necessarily need to be at every Resiliency Committee meeting, but we would want to pull them in or make sure that their input is included as appropriate. So just to clarify.
Okay, and so this is a significant change from the past. There are fewer city employees on the committee. However, they're listed as resources now. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think the reason for that, and again, anybody else who wants to chime in here, I mean, the real rationale I think behind that is given limited hours, bandwidth, and so forth, trying to prioritize the staff focus on the work that needs to be done between the meetings on this and other projects, rather than the amount of time spent in meetings. So because we'll be working together with John Eric, with Lise Reed, if it's a parks project, you know, on these things, it's the best allocation of folks' time while trying to achieve the same end result, essentially. So.
And I think the reason we had the makeup of the original committee was because we were writing the plan. And so that was a little bit different focus. And now that the plan is done, we've already begun implementing, and you know, now we're moving into a new level, and time for new ideas, new blood, and new chairs, and it's all good. And thank you. I really appreciate the new members who have stepped up, you know, to breathe some new life into where we're going with all of this. So I really appreciate it. So my understanding, Jane, that you're picking up as chair, Sarah as co-chair. Is that true? No? Yes?
That's actually news to me.
That's me as well.
No?
Yeah.
Yes?
I've not heard that. I've not had any conversation or heard that, so.
Oh, okay. All those in favor of Sarah being co-chair? No. No, is that something you and Jane would do together? I mean, it's really helpful to have two, because sometimes somebody can't make it, or just to bounce things off, and, you know, whatever. It's just always been helpful to have co-chairs.
Right, but I think we need to have a conversation with David. I don't know what his thinking is.
I already did. He wants off.
He's okay.
He's
Great.
done.
And he has talked to me about it a bit. I just didn't know that there had been conversations with you.
Yeah, no, he had mentioned it to me as well a while ago, but I didn't know if it was formal, if he had spoken. with
I
him
think he
about it.
said it in a previous meeting too.
He
Yeah.
did. Okay.
He has whiskey to sell apparently.
Yes, that's right.
Time
He
for
did.
Cindy
Now,
to get off.
now I remember.
This is all, of course, Jane, if you're interested in being, no one should be pushing this position on anyone on the committee. Yeah.
You all will bear with me while I get, you know, up to speed and all that. I'm yeah, I'd be honored. So that
Yeah.
would be. And Sarah, you want my co-pilot? That would be great. But we can talk.
Yeah, okay. It's the first I've heard of it, so I
No,
have
it's
to mull it over a bit.
Yes, please do. Please do. And Heather, we've got Heather too. Where's Heather? I don't see her face. I saw her
Yeah, she's
earlier.
there.
I mean, is a potential too in terms of I just think it's really helpful. And you always have all the resources of
Right.
city staff, the planning office, Molly, myself, my office, Julia, you know, we're all here to help and support. But I can't tell you I don't think we would still be working on this plan if we didn't have our taskmaster, David, behind
Yes,
us.
absolutely true.
Because we're all spread so thin.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
where you, as committed, really concerned volunteers help us so much to get us to the other end when we're doing projects like this.
Right.
So
Speaking to that point, I know that there's a concern about moving forward and meeting monthly due to staff limit, time,
Correct.
limitations on staff time. And so we had talked briefly after the hazard mitigation plan meeting about how to do that. And I don't think we simply don't have time right now to come to a resolution on that. But something that came up for food for thought is to move and I'm not sure how I feel about this, so it's truly, food for thought, but to move the meetings to a quarterly basis with the entire group and anyone else that serves as a resource that we would like, we need input from, or ideally everyone. So it would be committee members and resource city staff. And then, but continue to meet monthly on a topic-based agenda. So say the volunteers or certain city employees are making headway on, for instance, water or zoning on Plum Island, God forbid. And we pull in those people from the city and those volunteers that are most interested in those topics, and we meet that month. And then the next month would be another topic, just so we keep moving, keeping ourselves accountable, keeping ourselves informed, but we're not robbing, tons of time unnecessarily from city staff on a monthly basis if they do not need to attend a meeting because that topic isn't relevant. And so, I guess I'm throwing that out there and seeing what folks think. I know we're very short on time right now, maybe first thoughts, and then we can address it.
I want to just quickly add one thing to what you said, Jane, and I think that is what we discussed at the end of the last meeting, and add one additional thing, which is that I think we also talked about there being an annual, one of those quarterly meetings where everybody would come, including the relevant city staff, would be an annual priority setting meeting where we go back and we look at the plan all together and we decide what are going to be the projects that we're going to apply for grant funding for this year. Are we going to apply for MVP action grant? Okay, so for which project, and just set those annual priorities, and then the rest of and then sort of like set that loose, and the rest of the years sort of follow through on all the other things.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. That would be key. Thank you, Julia.
Right. And I think that makes sense to do the quarterly only if those monthly meetings are really monitored, or maybe it's Jane or the co-chair, whoever that might be, to make sure that there's follow-up and kind of oversight that they really are meeting. Like, are they really, going forward? Because that's the great thing about having monthly meetings, is that it spurs you on to get those tasks done that you said you were going to do, or that were implied in the last meeting. So if there's a sort of checkpoint that can happen, then I think it makes sense. If that is not going to happen, then I think things sort of fall apart. So I think that might be more of a question of the management of the committee.
Absolutely.
I agree.
If I am chair, I would attend every meeting. I don't know about Sarah, and I really need to have a powwow on this,
Okay.
or whoever else wants to be involved in leadership of the volunteers.
The other question I have, or at least with management of the committee, would it be more useful to have a chair and a vice chair as opposed to co-chairs? Because no, yes.
Whichever. I think either way, it's just having two people in some type of coordination chair positions. Whether
Yeah.
we call it
Yeah,
co-chairs
that makes
or
sense though,
chair and
Joe. I
vice
think
chair,
that makes
whichever,
sense.
it's fine.
Sounds like Jane needs to have a powwow with some people.
Yes.
We'll have wine. It'll work out.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
That's all you need, a little wine.
And then, okay, so moving on, I don't want that to get lost, so let's keep that at the top of the next agenda to make sure that we do make some decisions on that.
Yeah, I would also suggest, just because we sometimes see a lot of items on the agenda, touch base with Julia, and because she'll be the one coordinating with Diane to post the agenda. I think just thinking about what we can accomplish in the hour, and what is the most efficient use of time, whether the agenda should be, like you have here, focused on a specific issue versus the full breadth of things, which sometimes spreads us too thin. So.
But you just said the next meeting would be focused on the hazard mitigation plan? Because you're
Yes.
using. a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, so we would probably circle back to this in September then. But any side conversations that we have to do or need to do for the management of the committee in the meantime.
Okay.
That sound all right? Consideration for a resiliency resolution. I'm not prepared to speak to that specifically. Is anyone else, or should that be something we,
Table.
how's the
Yeah.
group on table?
Let's table that.
I think it's fine to table. We did talk at one point in one of the meetings about whether or not that was a huge priority versus implementation debate that might happen on the council floor about what kind of language is in it or how specific it is. But I agree with the concept. I just don't know if it's the best prioritization of our efforts right now.
I agree with you. And I'm just going to add that I, looked at the whole thing, and, I think it's good for a community that's just pulling together to do resiliency work. We are so beyond and a resolution does nothing. It has no standing. It has no force. It doesn't mean anything, and it ends up in a drawer somewhere. And it ends up, it really has no legal standing, a resolution. It just means that rah, we care about this. And we've, I think, shown by our resiliency plan that it means a lot more than creating this 3-page thing. Has to go to council, then it would have to go to committee, then we'd all have to come to committee, we'd all have to go over it. I don't understand.
I think actually this, I know what you're referring to, Donna. It had come up a month or so ago about a resolution on they're declaring like a climate emergency. And this is not that. This is more like making a public statement of city policy that every project in the city that the city takes on shall consider resiliency as part of its process.
It
Is
shouldn't
that
be a resolution, it should be an ordinance.
Should be an
It should be an
order.
ordinance.
Yeah,
If
something
you
like
want
that.
to
Yeah,
have some teeth to it.
right.
It has
Right.
to be more than a resolution.
And so maybe Andy, we're talking about this energy ordinance. Maybe that could be added to that one.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing, Molly. I mean, the discussion of net zero and whether or not we're having an ordinance that calls for city projects to incorporate, energy reduction or efficiency items. It's very similar to that, I think. And I agree with the mayor that an ordinance would be worth the time and effort and beneficial to some degree, whereas a resolution just is going to sit in a drawer somewhere per se. So I agree.
Well, why don't we talk about that in the next couple of weeks before we get together on, what is it, the 18th, and see what form, if there's some utility there, it might want to take.
Okay.
Okay.
How should I'll just take that on as for following up, but how should we follow up on that?
Yeah, I would say coordinate with Julia. She can make sure that if there's any staff that need to be involved, where we can be there, we can do a Zoom or in person. I'm happy to draft, an ordinance or whatnot that would, speak to these things. But I think in general, I would agree with the comments that were made a moment ago about what's beneficial. Resiliency, resolution is helpful, but unless it's mandatory, it doesn't hold any teeth. And I do agree with the mayor that having a full-blown plan with all the recommendations specifically in it is much more powerful statement than, a resolution. The ordinance, if it mandates that policy be considered for projects, is beneficial, right? To some degree. And I think would maybe make a little bit more sense.
So
That all sounds good, but I thought the conversation in email was that we should invite a conversation with those people rather than not dismissing it without having the conversation.
we are currently having 2 different conversations.
Yeah, that's a different.
Yeah, definitely.
I wasn't sure what this was about. So we have 2 conversations. One, Sarah and I realized we do need to follow up on that email chain and reach out to them if we decided to reach out to them, we certainly have to. That was with the group that is asking cities and towns to adopt the resiliency resolution is the word, and that's where this confusion is coming from. So
Okay.
there's that line, and then there's the other issue, the other conversation we are having simultaneously on a potential city ordinance to incorporate have all city departments, for instance, all city departments to incorporate resiliency in their decision-making process. And that has teeth, that has much more teeth than what the other group, just two different things. And
The first one's they're calling climate emergency.
right.
That's the differentiation.
I think I just heard Andy volunteer to draft something for that ordinance. Is that? And
Yeah, I'm happy to give you something for the next meeting to take a look at. Again, I would open it to the mayor and others to comment on what makes sense, but I think that.
Andy, no, you can't get it done for the next meeting. Let's be real here.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing on the hazardous plan.
Yeah.
So why don't you focus on having something ready for September?
okay.
Fair enough.
Yes.
That
Yep.
gives you plenty of time.
September.
And I think that's much more realistic in terms of getting it done. There's just too much going on over the next, 3.5 weeks.
Sure. Well, and hopefully there'll be a little more clarity about the net zero discussion,
Yes.
which
I was gonna say
might
that.
coincide a little bit, for some sort of policy discussion by the council about what ordinances or
Right.
policies might be.
Right,
appropriate.
and we're very fortunate to have Barry here now with us as a city councilor who is very engaged in these issues, who could be very helpful in moving this forward in the fall and sponsoring it. But I think, we don't have to rush. We haven't had one. So let's be sure that we're looking at all parameters of what needs to go into this before we do it.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
And yeah, I understand that there's other interest or interest from other counselors as well. So this
Yes.
this makes
Yes,
sense.
there is.
That would be great.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Jay, just a real quick thing. Andy, if you need help with that, just let me know on the ordinance side of it, because
Thank you.
I'm getting pretty familiar with Cambridge's and with Boston's. It might be a
Perfect.
Thanks.
Awesome. How are we doing? Do we want to keep moving? I feel bad. I think like the resiliency brochure and speaker series, I don't want to, what's the group thing? Should we address those quickly or wrap up?
So on the speaker series, I can email it.
That would be great, Sarah. Thank you.
John Eric's not here. How's the brochure coming, Julia?
The resiliency brochure is still working on the final text. I'm almost done with it, so I should be able to send it to Bill Goff probably tomorrow or early next week after Molly and Andy take a look at what I've put together. It's nearly done,
Great.
at least a draft. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Excellent. And then let's reach. I have to admit I don't know what this last point is.
But this is,
Sorry.
this is something I forgot about actually, but I could forward it. And actually within the context of the ordinance, it should be probably plugged into that conversation. But a while back, this is going back at least, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, when we were actually looking at the New England Development Project down on the waterfront for a while. Jared Eigerman and I were having a whole entire series of conversations about like, how can we start to institute some zoning,
Okay.
potentially modifications along the coast to try to mitigate. So if, like, for instance, if we're going to go ahead and allow them to build that many different condos, what are we going to actually ask them to do in terms of fortifying the waterfront, things like that?
Yeah, so the SPR, I think, is referring to site plan review. That, just to clarify, we have some standards in the ordinance dealing with different issues like traffic and so forth, but to incorporate in there additional standards that need to be looked at when the boards are looking at projects, right, for review. So Rick Tainter, for instance, on the planning board is particularly interested in updating some of the standards there. And they've been, as we go to the next sections of the zoning ordinance we want to update, we're looking to incorporate some of that in there. So draft language or bullets or things that folks would like to see as either performance measures or deliverable that shows something is going to be as energy efficient as possible or resilient as possible. That's the kind of thing we're talking about.
Right. So I took a compilation of 3 different standards and said that you can't really use any of those standards because they're way too comprehensive in a way of looking at it. So, and then kind of just cut a bunch of it out and said that these might be some things to consider. But this is probably 3 years old at this point, 3 or 4 years. So I could find that email and dig it out. But I think, Andy, as you and I are talking about it, then we can figure out how to like maybe just
That makes sense.
roll this into that.
Yeah, it's good timing because in the coming months, we'll be bringing forward the cleanup of that section of the ordinance. So it'd be good to insert that in there with some basic parameters at least. So.
Great. Okay. Any other business that isn't here that we can do super quick?
I had just one comment regarding the agenda. All the acronyms, since it's going to be a public agenda, all the acronyms should be
I agree.
whether
Good
there's a
point.
glossary at the bottom or whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't know what half of these were.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. All right, so
Very
next-
comprehensive. You did a nice job. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jane.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Great job
Great job.
sharing.
What is AOB?
Any other
Your
business?
business.
Any other
I had
business?
to Google that. I wasn't sure.
New business. Okay.
That's Dave, that's his Davidism.
Okay.
What is AOB? All right, so next meeting is the 18th of August, same time, and it will be addressing the hazardous mitigation plan. And then we'll circle back to a regular meeting on September. It sounds like we have some work to do
Yep.
between now and
Yep,
then.
and I will send out the agenda for the next meeting as well as a copy of the hazard mitigation plan recommendations once those get a little more ironed out. And also just an email of the list of committee members to you all, so you have each other's direct emails and things like that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And
I'll be in
and
touch.
Jane, just one thing. It took me about 10 years to figure out how to run a conservation commission meeting, so you have time.
Thank you. Thank you.
You did great, Jane.
Didn't
Yeah,
take-
no,
Great.
Jane, we're not worried about you
Natural.
whatsoever.
Thanks, guys. All right, well, take care and we'll see you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.